Well, it's been a while, but I thought it was about time for an armchair series. Yes, I'm sitting in my armchair. And this time around, we're going to be exploring the best of the best. No, the worst of the best. Because let's face it, sooner or later, they all screw up. It's fair enough. Of course, if at any time you disagree with my choices, I'll be happy to hear your ideas on any of these marques and their worst cars and why in the comments. I hope this opens up a lot of discussion actually, because it's a sensitive topic and people have different ideas about different things. So I might get a whole load of "how dare you" slag the that's fine. Love to enter some conversation about it. So please do comment on this episode. If you haven't already subscribed down here somewhere, give it a thumbs up, obviously, because you're still watching, so you should. And all right, let's get on with it. And it would be rude not to kick off with Ferrari, obviously. I mean, aren't they? Are they the premium marque? I don't know. Anyway, they've produced some pretty horrible stuff in the past, we have to say. Obviously, for this particular marque, I consulted with my dear friend Michael Carpenter at IDR, Italian Design and Racing, Ferrari specialists, and we came to the same conclusion. Many would list the 308 GT4, but he and I happen to have a little soft spot for that, so that's not going to happen. I mean, it's a beautiful car, Bertone designed, and 2+2, and I would like to have one, honestly. So it's not that. There's a few other dogs to choose from. Yes, shock horror, the Testarossa, now fetching quite a pretty penny and somewhat sought after, but I was never a fan. Obviously, inevitably, it's the Mondial. Yes. Probably still the cheapest Ferrari you can buy, and honestly, still not a bad car. It's just not the best they've ever produced. And talking with my friend Michael at IDR, they have one if you're interested, so I'll put a link in the description. But if you've always wanted a Ferrari and your budget is 50k ish, then you could do worse. You could buy a Porsche. We'll get onto them later, but let's stick with the Mondial for now. Oops, just lost half the audience, all the Porsche lovers. As you know, I'm not a fan, but they have produced some shockers as well. They all have. So, although it's somewhat similar in looks to the GT4, it is in fact designed by Pininfarina, not Bertone, and just a little bit more. I've always found Pininfarina just a little bit more fussy in their design. I mean, obviously they've produced some beautiful stuff, but yeah, this one didn't kind of cut it, obviously. And of course it's a 1980s car, and I've got to be honest, the 80s weren't good for car design, really. Can't think of anything really spectacular that was built in the 80s that looked good, which is very unfortunate because it was when I was a young man, just starting to drive. Yeah. So, apart from the styling, what else is underwhelming about the Mondial? Well, for kickoff, it started life with a very weedy, barely over 200 horsepower V8. 0 to 60 time was like 8.5 seconds, which was pretty slow, honestly, even for then. And they later improved that with the 32 valve version and got it just under 6 seconds actually by the end of production. So one of those later models might be a bit more fun. The interior as well was pretty dull and uninteresting, honestly. I suppose trying to be a bit more modern, but given the exotic attention to detail in some of the 70s and 60s cars, this is really quite drab, saved only by the fact that it's still got the gated gear shift, of course, which is just super cool. All in all, the 80s weren't a good time for Ferrari. They were getting their pants thrashed in Formula 1 by the likes of Lotus and Williams and all kinds of other teams. And yeah, just probably a low point in their history, I have to say. Perhaps you agree. Anyway, we mentioned Porsche, so let's carry on with that. As you know, it would be hard for me to find a best one. I'm not a Porsche fan, although I do appreciate why people like them. Just never been my thing. So yeah, any of the 911s really. Well, no, not the early ones. I like the early ones. The early ones were dainty little sports cars, which is obviously what it started life out as. And they've just ended up bloated, and I guess all cars have, with all the safety BS that you have to put in these days. So all right, we're not going to pick a 911. I mean, I guess it has to be the 924, right? Now, I hope I got this the right way around, but it was originally designed by Porsche for Audi, and Audi decided they didn't like it, and quite rightly so. And again, a measly little 4-pot delivering no horsepower at all, and the styling was just a bit meh, you know. I mean, vastly improved when the flared arches that the 944 brought about in the kind of evolution of the car, if you like. So the 944 is actually quite an attractive car, and more powerful, obviously, as well. Especially if you throw a Chevy small block in there, but that's another episode entirely. Anyway, however weedy it was still quite popular. Poor man's Porsche, I guess. Much cheaper than the 911, of course. And don't know what else to say about it, really. The interiors were quite wacky, I have to say. You could have them in any pyjama material you liked. They did eventually produce some quite interesting derivatives, which are now quite well sought after and fetch good money. Obviously there was the turbo version, and then later the Carrera and the Carrera GT, which actually are quite special little cars. And then of course it evolved into the 944, and to add to their front-engined cars, there was the 928, of course, completely different beast, and one that I'm very fond of, actually, probably one of my favourite Porsches. So that's enough Porsche bashing for one day, I think. It's far too easy. Let's find somebody else to trash. Oh, I know, Aston Martin, yes. We like trashing them too. No, I love a lot of Aston Martins, actually. They're very, very beautiful cars. Anyway, of course, I consulted my dear friend Mr. Sansom on this, because he's owned more Aston Martins than I've had hot dinners. And again, there's some debate, obviously, depending on your preferences. I mean, many would choose the ludicrous Lagond, which was beyond radical, honestly, a crazy departure, and because of that, I don't think it's so bad, actually. So we're not going to pick that. No, we're going to pick something more mediocre. Yes, the Virage. Again, in the automotive doldrums of the 80s, Aston too was struggling to produce anything really inspiring. So, seeing as he's the expert, I'm going to quote him verbatim as to why the Virage was the low point, possibly, of Aston Martin. So I'm just checking my notes. So he starts off with very expensive, very unreliable, electronics that didn't work, big, heavy, chunky porker is what he called it. And he's right, it's nearly £4,000. That's a lot of car, despite the fact it was built out of aluminium. Yeah, so there's a lot of aluminium. And the 5.3 litre, although a nice torquey motor, it was underpowered. Simple as that. Suffered from the usual early fuel injection kind of issues, didn't really work properly, apparently, according to Mr. Sansom. And of course, in typical Aston Martin form, it was expensive to run and maintain. I may be wrong, but I think I'm not. A client of mine back in the 90s had a Zagato version. Did they make a Zagato version of this? And that was no better, honestly. Equally horribly looking, as was the shooting brake, which apparently they made 2 of at the factory in Newport Pagnell, near where I used to live. Yes, didn't improve the looks, did it? They did, however, improve the motor over time, eventually, of course, by strapping on a couple of superchargers and turning it into the Vantage, which was an epic muscle car, honestly. And Aston have always kind of produced the English muscle car, as well as some really proper GTs, Grand Tourers. As I say, I've never owned an Aston Martin. I have driven the DB7 and V8 Vantage, more recent V8 Vantage. Both beautiful cars to drive. The DB7 was my friend's, Mr. Sansom, and for a big car, it was surprisingly nimble, I have to say. Not dissimilar to the Maserati Grand Sport that I owned in terms of chuckability. Yeah, good car. He had the V12 version, obviously. Anyway, so back to the Mirage. Yeah, all in all, just again, like so many manufacturers in the 1980 doldrums, not Aston Martin's best for sure. Anyway, sticking with my friend Mr. Sansom and the infamous rivalry between Aston Martin and Corvette at Le Mans, at least in this century. Here he is in a Corvette. Yeah. Apparently it broke down later that day. I think he sabotaged it. So yes, Corvette, one of my favourite marques, as you may well know by now. Owner of 2, the C3 1969 Stingray, and one of the very first C6 into the UK. Love them both very much, so obviously it's not going to be one of those, is it? In my early days of Corvette fanaticism, it would have been relatively easy for me to pick just one of the random C4s, because they've always been kind of the least popular model, I guess. Although, of course, there was a fabulous first ZR1 developed in conjunction with Lotus, which was a phenomenal car. But, you know, looks-wise, ironically, again, for me, because I love wedgy cars, I was never really a big fan. But that's because I didn't really look closely enough at them. And if you do take the time to have a look at a C4, there are actually some really nice design features, really subtle kind of curves within the wedgy shape. So over the years I've actually become more of a fan of them, honestly, and you can still pick those up fairly cheap. I mean, they're still not popular in terms of, you know, versus the old original C3s, the chrome bumper C3s, the C2s, obviously, 1s, etc. But it's not a C4, no, it's actually a C3. And again, I did a little research online just to see what general opinions were, and I think I have to agree, the later years of the C3, because it went on for a very long time, from the 60s right through to the 80s, 15 years in all, which is a long time for one kind of model. And of course, during that time, just like honestly De Tomaso with the Pantera and Lamborghini with the Countach, they just kind of bastardized it and took it down to Halfords and O'Reilly's and bought a load of body kit and threw it on, and it just kind of got worse and worse, and the motor got less and less exciting relatively. So it seems the general opinion is that the worst ever Corvette is the 1982 collector edition, which I have to agree with, yeah. Interestingly, there was one on Bring a Trailer recently that went for 25k, so obviously they're not that unpopular. But this, of course, was at the very tail end of the production of the C3 before they introduced the C4. Desperately kind of scrabbling around to come up with new ideas to make it a little bit more interesting, and failing dismally. But metallic beige is not really the best answer to that solution, nor is silver look leather interior. Quite gaudy, in fact, and at the time, obviously the most expensive Corvette yet, at over $20,000. What were they thinking? And of course, the massive 5.7 litre engine was putting out an enormous, underwhelming 200 horsepower. My 69 at 350. What? I mean, what? The only saving grace for me were the turbine wheels, which are more 70s than 80s, and again, just a quirky little thing that I happen to like. But yeah, all in all, I mean, just a horrible way for the C3 to finally expire. Of course, if at any time you disagree with my choices, I'll be happy to hear your ideas on any of these marks and their worst cars, and why, in the comments. I hope this opens up a lot of discussion, actually. So, who should we pick on next? Well, let's do Maserati. Didn't have to confer with anyone really on this subject, because I've owned two of them, neither of which are going to feature. Although I have to say, you know, the modern Ghibli is like pretty bloody average, honestly. But don't tell my wife I said that. She loves it, adores it. I did confer with Mr. Sansom. Of course, we agreed. It's the Bi Turbo, for Christ's sake. Oh, what? Another 80s child? Yes. It really was a terrible time, wasn't it? Yes, it's just a shocking car. Fairly shocking styling. I mean, it's a bit different, I suppose. Wedgy again, obviously, and yes, I like wedges, but this is not a particularly pretty one, is it? No, it's kind of more blocky than wedgy. Again, like the Virage, horribly unreliable, terrible engine, underpowered again, fairly boring interior, horrible to look at, really. I mean, they're so bad, and you can pick them up so cheap that there is one racing in the 24 Hours of Lemons. Oh, I doubt it's got the original motor. I don't know enough about it, but I've seen pictures. I'm assuming it's some kind of engine swap, probably a Chevy. Anyway, crazy idea all round, as was the original. So yeah, I mean, they produced some later versions like the, what's it called? I don't know, Kamal, something like that. I don't know. Which, I guess because of their scarcity, are kind of sought after. But it was a disastrous time for Maserati. They were going through a lot of trouble, as were Aston Martin, actually, in those days. So difficult to produce something new and exciting when you haven't really got the budget. Clearly one of the worst cars they've ever produced. Not that I'm a fan of the new SUV either. Let's not get into that whole area, because the only people that have really done that successfully, I think, are probably Lamborghini. Although I quite like the Jaguar one, but just stop it. Oh, of course, Porsche, Cayenne, whatever. Let's not get into sports and GT car manufacturers producing SUVs, because that's another subject altogether. Which brings us neatly onto Lotus. And no, we're not going to pick their SUV as the worst one either, because it doesn't really count. It's not a proper Lotus. So that's a bit difficult to decide what's the worst Lotus ever produced. Well, I thought I'd start out by seeing what everyone else thought, so I googled it, and shock horror, it was the original Elite, which is just wrong. I mean, that's a pretty little car. It might not be very reliable at the time. I mean, it was Colin Chapman's first ever kind of real production car, so I'm sure it was shoddily built, but at the same time, beautiful piece of engineering. So That's bollocks. That's British saying. I mean, they have produced some Marmite cars, love it or hate it, that is, for you Americans. Like the Europa. I absolutely adore the Europa. I mean, yeah, it's a quirky looking car, but fundamentally, apparently, just an amazing car to drive. As I understand it, with the Europa, it was developed in conjunction with Ford for a serious Le Mans contender. Alongside the GT40, it was basically Lotus and whoever did the GT40 kind of vying for attention with Ford. Anyway, they didn't get the job, obviously. Anyway, the Europa was just an amazing handling car, and one of the ones that I'd like to actually own, before I snuff it. We'll get on to that in another series. So, as I say, that left me with a couple of choices, honestly. The Lotus Eclat was kind of a derivation of the Elite. The Elite itself was kind of, that's different. And the Eclat was like, that's worse and still a bit weird. Kind of on the Aston Martin Lagond side of things, not quite that radically awful, but or different, you know what I'm saying. And the other one, of course, was the front-wheel drive Isuzu-powered Elan. Really, just a departure from everything that Lotus kind of stood for. And guess who had one? Yes, Mr. Sansom. I mean, they're not a bad car, and when I first saw it, it's like, oh, that's cute, but then it's all wrong. Yeah, it's just not. It's not Lotus. So you're off the hook, Mr. Sansom. It is the Eclat. I think the Eclat is probably the worst car they've ever produced, and really, just from a aesthetic point of view, it's a bit, yeah. And you know, it's 2+2, except, you know, and children in the back maybe. Not very powerful, not very pretty. So again, lemons. I actually crashed into it once. There is a team called Lotus, because they have taken a Lotus Eclat and put a Chevy small block in it, as you do with everything in lemons. And it took them years when we first started racing against them. We had the Nissan 300, which was horribly underpowered and blah blah blah, and we were level with them, and over the years they've developed and refined this thing, come up with all kinds of Lotus themes. It's wonderful, but yeah, total disaster, I think, really, for Lotus. Again, oh, we're in the 80s. Recurring theme here, people. Who shall we pick on next? Well, it'd be rude not to include Lamborghini in all this, who of course have produced some amazing cars, stunning looking, crazy cars. Honestly, some of the modern stuff, I mean, some of the one-offs or whatever, I mean, it's just been ugly. But they don't really count because they're not like full-blown production cars, really. So let's stick to production. And whilst we're in the 1980s, we're going to go back in time a little bit. Yeah, because this was from the mid-70s. The 80s, they kind of started getting their shit together. I know people aren't big fans of the Jalpa, the Silhouette that preceded it, followed it. I don't forget which way round. I think it was Silhouette first, then the Jalpa. I kind of like those, as featured in the film Rocky 2, 3, 7, I don't know. But they're kind of cool. I mean, I know they got Fiat door handles, same as the Stratos and whatever else, but they weren't a bad looking car. So it's not the Jalpa, which many might choose. I don't know. No, for me it's the Jarama. yes, I know the Jarama could have been a contender too, but I kind of like them too. They're interesting looking, whereas the Jarama is just horrific, really. It was trying, but it just kind of failed. I mean, it had the semi-covered, semi-pop-up headlights, like the Alfa Romeo Montreal, which is one of the most beautiful cars ever, like the Iso Grifo. Yeah, but the Jarama just failed. I guess it was supposed to be wedgy, but it kind of failed on that as well. I mean, that back end is just hideous. It's like I think the same designer might have had something to do with the new Tesla Cybertruck. I mean, it's just done with a ruler. Horrible. Its only saving grace, of course, was that it had the Lamborghini V12, and you can't beat a V12. But that's about the end of it. It really just wasn't wacky enough to warrant the badge of a Lamborghini. I mean, its predecessor, I guess, was a Spada, which was, you know, a really wacky looking car. And this was just run of the mill. The performance was nothing exciting. The interior was just kind of thrown together. So if you were going to give Lamborghini a school report on this, it would be could do better. Well, I think I've been droning on for quite long enough. This is way longer than a normal episode. So if you enjoyed it, if you did, give it a thumbs up. As I said before, appreciate any comments you have if you disagree or agree with those I've selected for these marks, and of course suggestions for other marks to visit in another episode. I've got a few up my sleeve already, so we'll do this again. In which case, of course, please subscribe down here somewhere so you can watch that one too, because you're still here, so I guess you liked it. And of course, encourage others to watch my lunacy.